Hi, I'm Alex Udris, and thanks for joining us tonight for Boldmethod Live IFR, where we're going to talk about LNAV procedures and hopefully clear up some concepts like RNP and LPV, LNAV, VNAV, and LNAV, and kind of help us understand what we're looking at when we look at a chart. And this is going to be looked at from the pilot's perspective, not a procedure designer perspective, but something that we can use when we actually pull up an RNAV procedure in the cockpit. Tonight we've got Corey Komaric managing our chat. So as I'm going through this presentation, if you have any questions or if you want me to go into more depth, throw a question out there in chat. Corey will grab it and forward it over to Colin Cutler, who's our technical director tonight. He'll work it up on screen. Don't wait for the end. Throw questions in all the way throughout the presentation. Makes it a lot more interesting. Okay, so we're going to start tonight by looking at performance-based navigation, or PBN. And then we're going to start to distill that down into the difference between RNAV and RNP and where GPS ties into all of this. And then we're going to look at those different lines of minima and nav specs and understand where all that comes from. And then we'll look at how our aircraft use that. And then finally, we'll talk about what happens if we lose RNAV capabilities while we're flying an RNAV approach procedure. That last part is something that we occasionally get an email question on, but many people really never think much about, and you really need to. What happens if your RNAV capability downgrades as you're flying a procedure? What's going to happen? So we got a couple videos at the end to demonstrate what would happen in a G1000NXI, and we can relate that to a lot of other aircraft as well. Okay, so let's start with the question, what is performance-based navigation? And the graphics department has worked up a fabulous slide that tells us a lot about that. This is my favorite slide of the entire presentation. Colin, you want to cut to it? Right here. That's what it is.
And now you get to talk.
So if people think I'm reading from the iPad when I'm doing this, I'm not, because right now it doesn't help me. Performance-based navigation is a new concept for RNAV. And by new, I mean new in the world of aviation, not 50 years old. And so when we start to think about RNAV, most people think about GPS. GPS is RNAV. But some people who might be in their early 40s remember days of flying course line computers where you could use VOR and DME to kind of area navigate and not go directly to each one of those spoken hub VORs. That also was a form of RNAV. And some of us remember LORAN, which was a ground-based system fairly similar to GPS, not in operation, but in service. And that, itself was a type of RNAV. So we talk about RNAV, it actually extends back quite a while. Ships have been using LORAN for a long time. RNAV is just simply area navigation. The ability to navigate through an area without going to specific ground station points. That's what RNAV is. It means that you don't have to fly to a station and then track outbound and do this kind of dog-leg radial thing. Area nav means that we can go pretty much anywhere, and it's been around forever. And then in the 90s, GPS showed up, and it became certified for aircraft in the mid to late 90s, but we didn't have a full concept of how it would change the national airspace system. So we started to integrate it laterally as kind of a, okay, you can use this, but you need to have backups. And then eventually that has evolved into our modern GPS-based system, where we've got GPS satellites telling us our position, and then space-based augmentation, SBAS, which we call Wide Area Augmentation in the United States, or WAAS. Those satellites giving us information to make our position really, really accurate, and in some cases even ground-based augmentation for certain airline operations that they're testing out, where you're using ground-based transmitters to make that position ultra accurate. All of this has grown out of this old concept of RNAV. And so because of that, the FAA has come up with a concept of performance-based navigation. And essentially, what we're trying to do with PBN is allow aircraft to fly a three-dimensional path through the national airspace system and allow aircraft of varying capabilities to fly varying path requirements. So essentially, based off your aircraft's avionics performance capabilities, there are certain procedures and paths that you can fly and others that you can't. That's what PBN is. It's kind of this umbrella for everything RNAV. And again, it's easy to think, well, yeah, RNAV is all GPS now. Not so. You've got DME, RNAV, on some transport, especially older transport category aircraft and some business jets, where you use 2 or more DME facilities to triangulate your position. You could have inertial reference units, ring laser gyros, inertial reference systems that basically start out with a known position on the ground and spin up and then essentially track the aircraft's acceleration as it flies and come up with a predicted position. You know, before we had GPS over the ocean, that was one of the ways to get an idea of where you were. Its accuracy degraded over time, but it could usually get you into where you needed within a few miles. All of these are still out there in the National Airspace System. And if you look at a modern airliner, it's not just using GPS. It has GPS possibly. It might have WAAS, though not all of them do, but then it may be backing that up with DME information, VHF information. So RNAV isn't just GPS. It's GPS plus all of the other technology that we have developed over time to help us figure out where we are without going directly to a ground-based nav station. Okay, so that brings up the concept of RNP, or Required Navigation Performance. And that we actually have a really good slide for. Okay, so RNP is a performance-based navigation system that includes onboard performance monitoring and crew alerting capability. And the aircraft needs to meet the requirement, or for an aircraft to meet the requirements of performance-based navigation, a specified RNAV or RNP accuracy must be met 95% of the flight time. Okay, so PBN, it says essentially RNP, Required Navigation Performance, includes 2 very important parts. The ability for it to autonomously monitor the system's performance, to know whether it is as accurate as it needs to be. Okay, to be able to say, yes, I know right now, I can guarantee you that I know my position within a mile, or 0.3 miles, or 40 meters. Okay, it autonomously can figure that out. Okay, and then the second part is that if it realizes I can't guarantee that I am within 30 meters or 40 meters or 0.3 miles of where I think I am, I can't guarantee that. I don't know I'm wrong, but I can't guarantee it anymore. Then it needs to be able to alert the crew so that the crew can come up with alternate navigation procedures to navigate through the National Airspace System. So those 2 very important points. And we think about that going back to old school GPS when they first started installing the aircraft, the original Garmin 430s that did not have WAAS. We have RAIM, right? Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring. It's autonomous. We don't need ATC to help us. We don't need ground-based stations. It works because the receiver's got extra satellites and is just double checking its position. And RAIM allows for crew alerting. If RAIM detects that the position is bad, or if RAIM doesn't know if the position's bad, it just says, wow, I don't have enough satellites anymore to double check the position. It could be good, it could be bad. Either one of those 2 cases, it no longer meets PBN requirements and it can alert to you. And so that's essentially a PBN system. When we talk about an RNP system, that's what I should say. When we talk about RNP versus RNAV, the way you can look at it is RNAV doesn't necessarily have the ability to tell you that it's no longer accurate. RNAV doesn't know how accurate it is. And RNP can verify its accuracy, and if it for some reason can no longer tell its accuracy, it alerts you. So a way to think about that, RAIM or WAAS, that's RNP. If it ever loses its position or loses its ability to verify the position, it shows you a message in alert box. Ring laser gyros on an inertial reference system on an airliner built in the 80s. Those, as you spin them up on the ground, they know their exact position. That's picked up. It takes a long time for those to spin up. As they start flying, that accuracy starts to degrade. They don't know how much that accuracy is degraded. It's who knows? So that would be an RNAV system. It doesn't know if it can maintain accuracy. It just has a guess at a position. Okay, and again, for an aircraft to meet the requirements of PBN, a specified RNAV or RNP requirement must be able to be met 95% of the flight time. Okay, so that brings up the concept of nav specs. I'm going to show you a chart that most pilots really don't ever look at. But you can see we have both RNAV specifications, where the system can't guarantee its accuracy and it needs someone like ATC to monitor, or RNP, where it can self-monitor its position. And we have different standards. And so these are generally in miles here, with the exception of where we put an M for meters. And so you can see we have all these different nav specs here on the side. RNAV2, RNAV1, RNAV2, RNP2, RNP1, RNP approach, advanced RNP, RNP authorization required approach, and then a couple others. We'll talk about those in a different video. But when we start talking about the National Airspace System and what we're flying in, okay, we would either be RNAV2 or 1, RNP 2 or 1, because that's going to cover en-route domestic operations, our terminal arrivals, feeder routes, and terminal areas, and then RNP approach. Both the initial segment, the intermediate segment, so 1 mile RNP standard, 1 mile RNP standard, in the final approach segment, which is either 0.3 miles or could go down to 40 meters, and then the missed approach segment, which would be, again, another 1 mile RNP. Okay, so what does this chart have to do with real life, especially on an approach? When you fly a RNAV procedure, an RNAV approach procedure in the U.S. National Airspace System, you're flying an RNP approach, even though it does not say the words RNP in the title. And this is really confusing because someone's going, I've seen procedures that say RNAV RNP or say RNAV GPS. Absolutely. FAA wants to keep you on your toes. We use different naming conventions in different charts. But essentially, if you're out there in your Cirrus or Cessna or 172 and you're flying with an IFR certified GPS unit, okay, a 430, 430W, G1000, G1000, NXI, Avidyne, any of those IFR certified systems, you're flying, when you fly an approach procedure, you are flying an RNP approach. And so the system throughout that entire procedure needs to be able to verify its accuracy 95% of the flight time. So when you go back to that, all of a sudden that makes sense. You're like, yeah, RAIM or WAS, which always provides that verification. Okay, that makes sense to me. So when we fly an RNAV procedure, it's really an RNP approach. Okay, so where this can get confusing, and we're going to look at this in detail, we'll go back to the slide for a second, is this procedure right here, the RNP AR approach. Okay, in light aircraft, or when we're flying a procedure titled RNP GPS, what we're used to, RNAV, thank you, RNAV GPS, I can even get confused. RNAV GPS, we are flying an RNP approach. When you see those procedures titled RNAV and in parentheses RNP, then you're flying an RNP authorization required approach. The difference between these two is aircrew and aircraft certification and training. The authorization required procedures require additional training and certification so that aircraft can safely operate in close proximity. And typically, you see those in new airliners. You're not going to see them in older airliners. The 145s typically don't have them. Older CRJs, you're not going to see them there. But if you start to look at the new airliners, the 787, the Embraer 175, some of those, you'll find those equipped to fly the RNP authorization required approach. And again, it's not just the aircraft. The aircrew needs to be specially trained as well. So people go, would that be limited to the airlines? No, if you could afford the equipment under Part 91 and you want to go to flight safety or CAE and take the training, absolutely. Then you could also get approved by the FAA to operate on those procedures. And a lot of business operations do. Okay, we're going to talk about that in more detail in just a bit. But the key thing I want you to remember, the takeaway here, is even though in light aircraft with basic IFR GPS or WAS GPS equipment, we're still flying an RNP approach. Okay, let's talk about some minima. I think everybody's seen these on approach procedures. These are the different types of guidance, and there's a reason why we have them laid out this way. We have LPV, okay, or localizer precision with vertical guidance. we have LNAV, VNAV, which would be lateral navigation and vertical navigation. We've got LNAV, which is just lateral navigation, and we've got up here LP, which is just localizer performance. So essentially, each of these require different RNP capabilities. Okay, essentially they would require the LPVs and the LPs require the most precise level of RNP, all the way down to that 40 meters. LNAV, VNAV requires less precise RNP capabilities. And LNAV is essentially the same RNP requirement as LNAV, VNAV, it just doesn't include the VNAV part. Okay, so when we think of this, an LPV really is basically a GPS WASP-driven ILS. A lot of people get very confused about what an LNAV, VNAV procedure is. And here's a way to think about it. Originally, when they came up with the concept of LNAV, VNAV, and this is going back even before WASP was in the system, you had transport category aircraft which did have GPS with RAIN, so they could fly an LNAV procedure. But they also had flight management systems and advanced static systems, and they could compute a barometric glide path. They could use the GPS, basic GPS, even with RAIN, right, monitoring, is not accurate enough to give us a vertical glide path. But with the right computer technology and a tap into your static line, you could use that barometric system to create a vertical path. So that's what we call baro VNAV. And you'll hear this term kind of in charts and in aviation. Baro VNAV means that we're using a flight computer, and not an E6P, but like your avionics, either a flight management system or a newer avionics system, and that's tapped into the static system. And it's just using the change in pressure to draw a glide path. It's not using GPS or RNAV at all. So as we started to create GPS systems, what we said is, okay, well, if you have a Garmin 430, you could fly LNAV minimums. But if you're flying this transport category aircraft with this complicated FMS, we could build something in there that can draw this VNAV barometric path. We'll create LNAV, VNAV. Well, now that's all changed. And many aircraft, including like a modern G1000 or a G1000 NXI unit, are oftentimes equipped with the same logic, so they also can compute that same barometric VNAV system. And so we can really think of these as fallbacks. So let's take a look at that chart again. LPV requires the most level of RNP precision. If you're not equipped for it, or for some reason the receiver can't guarantee that level of RNP, maybe there's a WASP satellite out, then you can fall down to LNAV VNAV, a lower level of precision. However, this VNAV in most cases would need to be barometrically aided, or baro VNAV. And then finally, if you don't have baro VNAV capabilities and you were to not be able to maintain LPV, you would end up falling back to LNAV. That would be the lowest level of precision, the least accurate level of precision that you could fly. You'll notice LP is kind of off here on its own, and there's a reason for that. LP is not a fallback from LPV. Okay? LP is its own procedure. It's a procedure designed when a vertical glide path wouldn't be possible due to obstacles. We'll take a look at one of those into Colorado, but people get confused. They look at LPV and they go, well, if I lose something, can I fly an LP? No, they require essentially this, they require the same RNP values, so they're not a fallback. It's just an LPV, think of it as an ILS, okay? If the obstacle clearance planes permit, we can fly an ILS in, that's the most accurate. But in some airports, like Vail or Telluride, we could put a localizer in there, but we can't give you the glide path. There's just too much terrain around there. And so the same thing happens in the GPS world. We can put an LP in there. And if the aircraft can't guarantee the RNP requirements for lateral localizer precision minima, then it falls down to LNAV. So back to the slide, think of this as a fall down system. In a modern WAS-enabled aircraft, you start at LPV. The receiver is capable of flying LPV minima, okay? But if it doesn't have the RNP that's required for LPV, it will fall down. And then it can fall all the way down to LNAV. Okay, so let's take a look at what you need. LPV and LP require WAS, but WAS is also capable of creating an LNAV VNAV path, and WAS could fly an LNAV only path. Let's say you do not have a WAS enabled system. You've got basic GPS with baro weighting. You cannot fly LPV, but you could fly LNAV VNAV, and you could fly LNAV. And then finally, if you're only equipped with basic GPS and RAIM, you cannot fly LPV or LNAV VNAV. You would only be able to fly LNAV. So let's take a look at a procedure. This is the RNAV GPS to runway 17 left. It's Centennial, Colorado. And if you look at the procedure minima here, you can see LPV gets you the lowest. LNAV VNAV gets you not quite as low. And then LNAV gives you the highest straight-in minima. And then the circling to land minima over here, essentially, again, the receiver will show LNAV, LNAV VNAV, or LPV, but the circle to land minima is essentially always higher than LNAV. It's worse than LNAV, and you just artificially level out. So essentially, when you load a procedure, your GPS system, your RNAV system, is going to look at what RNP value it can give you, both what it's capable of doing and what satellites and information it has. And it will choose the best RNP solution, the most accurate, which is why when you go to load an RNP procedure in the database, it usually does not say LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV. It always typically says, if LPV minimums are published, it says LPV. It always typically says the lowest level of minimums. So one of the things that I hear oftentimes is, well, okay, if I don't want to fly an LPV, how would I load it up as an LNAV, VNAV, or just an LNAV? And the answer is, in a GPS system, in a modern GPS system, you can't. You can just choose to fly to those minimums and level out if you want. That's totally acceptable. But the receiver is going to choose the best possible RNP solution. That's what it's looking for. So if you were to see a procedure that had LPV minima, but the only thing maybe your Cirrus with baro weighting is giving you is LNAV VNAV, it's because you probably don't have WAS right now. You're just down to basic GPS. That WAS satellite reception isn't there. And so the system is smart enough to say, well, the only option here, the best option I should say, not the only, the best option is LNAV VNAV. And if you're to load up that exact same procedure from the database in an aircraft that has just a basic GPS unit. So if you load up this RNAV to runway 17 right or 17 left at Centennial with just a basic IFR certified GPS unit, the only minima that you will see next to the procedure name is LNAV, because that's all that it can do. So again, when people get confused, how would I fly to these other minima? The receiver always selects the best minima available for the procedure. And if you wanted to fly to lower minima, maybe for practice, the reality is you could artificially level out early, but there really isn't, other than going into the system setup and turning off WAS, there isn't a great way to get a receiver in operational use to step down. Okay, let's take a look at, this is it in a JEP chart. Let me show you quickly in an FAA chart. If you're using FAA charts, you can see it right here. They write those minima across the side. So here we've got LPV DA, LNAV VNAV DA, and then the LNAV MDA. And then again, circling is its own thing. The receiver itself will still indicate its best possible RNP solution. You're just going to level out at that circling minima, and that's going to be your lowest altitude, essentially your MDA. Okay, I said not every procedure will have all of those choices. So this is I'll show you here, the RNAV GPS Zulu to runway 9 in Telluride. So there's something that you should kind of pick up right away. It's got a Zulu as opposed to just RNAV GPS to runway 9. And if we end up with a Z, that means that we're going to start counting backwards in letters because we have multiple RNAV procedures to the same runway. Okay, remember if A, B, C, D, if we start with alpha, that's a circling procedure. But if we start with Zulu and Yankee and count backwards that way, it's a straight in procedure. It's just going to, there's multiple procedures using the same navigation equipment that are going into that runway. So at Telluride, we actually have two RNAV GPS procedures published. We have the RNAV GPS Zulu to runway 9 and the Yankee to runway 9. If we look back at the iPad, you can see why. So first of all, obstacles prevent us from using a glide path. So it is just a localizer precision LP procedure. There is no fallback here though for LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV. Okay? There's no LNAV option. And the reason is because of the lower, I'll stay down here, the lower minimum descent altitude. LNAV wouldn't give you, and it's not just that, even the segment altitudes, LNAV would not give you acceptable protection on the final approach course considering the altitude that you cross SEPMA at and then the minimum descent altitude that you continue down to. So here, you cross the final approach fix at 12.9 and you go down to 10.640. And the requirements for the procedure say the only RNP accuracy that would let you safely descend out of 12.9 and get lower would be LP. And then also possibly safely fly the missed approach procedure. Okay, so then we can look at the Yankee. And you'll notice we have a different final approach altitude. We cross the final approach at a different altitude, 100 feet higher. And now we have three different minima. So we have LP, if your receiver is able to get WAS and guarantee that it has that RNP standard. And then you'll notice no LNAV, VNAV because vertical guidance due to obstacles wasn't available on this procedure. So we just have LNAV. We have two of them here. One has a box note. And if we look at that, that's at the bottom. So I will highlight that as you read it. Missed approach requires a minimum climb of 380 feet per nautical mile to 12,500. If you cannot maintain the 380 feet per nautical mile to 12,500 on the missed, then you would need to fly to this LNAV requirement right here. 12,140 feet MSL. That's your new MDA. Okay. So the concept that I want you to keep in mind, again, what everybody gets confused about is I've got all these minima. Which one do I use? Well, your GPS receiver or your avionics system will give you the best RNP minima that it can fly. And then when you look at the chart, you'll need to determine if there are any missed approach climb requirements or climb gradient requirements that you need to meet. And you'll find the minima that both your onboard RNAV procedure can do, or receiver can do, and that you meet all of the approach requirements. Like you can make the required missed approach climb gradient. That's what you'll end up flying to. And keep in mind, you may end up in a situation where LP requires a climb gradient that you can't meet. So the receiver's saying LP, but you're still leveling off at an LNAV minima because it has a lower missed approach climb gradient. That would be just fine. Again, the receiver is always going to pick the best that it thinks it can do, and it's not going to consider any other climb requirements or anything like that. Okay, so we had talked a little bit about the fact that this is a RNP approach, right? It's categorized as an ICAO RNP approach. But if you look at the header says RNAV GPS. Never says the words RNP in there. But there are procedures that do say RNP. So this is Rifle, Colorado. This is the RNAV RNP Zulu to runway 8. Again, the Zulu is a hint that there's another RNAV procedure to runway 8. Okay, it would be Yankee. We'll look at that in a second. But when the FAA puts, or Jeppesen puts, RNP in parentheses, what they really mean is that this is an RNP-AR approach. It's a authorization required approach. So if you're flying with a 530 or an Avidyne unit, or a G1000, 1000 NXI, and you tried to load the RNAV Zulu, you'd find it doesn't load up from the database. Now, it probably was in the database that's sitting on the system, but the system knows that it's not certified to fly RNP-AR approaches, and so it will not offer you the procedure. And so that's the key. When you see the words RNP in there, what it really means is that it's an RNP-AR, RNP authorization required procedure, and that you can't fly it. Okay, so the question we get every once in a while is, why did they name it like that? If you have RNP and RNP-AR procedures, why don't they say that on the chart? That would make a lot of sense, right? Well, there's a couple problems. The coding in the database predates this concept of RNP-AR. We've been using the term RNAV for years. So if we switched all of the RNAV procedures to be called RNP, the FAA and the stakeholders said that's going to be really, really confusing. And ATC thought it would be very, very confusing as well. And then, of course, the concept of changing the database specs and changing the equipment, because some of this is hard-coded in the equipment so that they can correctly say RNP, that's not necessarily very practical either. So what the FAA came up with essentially is, yes, they're both RNP procedures. One's RNP, the other one's RNP authorization required. But it's just easier to call them RNAV. And we're going to use the information in parentheses to tell you whether you can fly this using your basic GPS RNP system or whether it's authorization required. And if it's AR, we're going to put RNP in the parentheses. With that, you'll notice ATC never says GPS or RNP when clearing you for the procedure. And that's because essentially it's just an RNAV procedure. So if they were clearing you, we'll go back to this procedure right here on the iPad. If they were clearing you for the RNAV Zulu to runway 8, they're not going to say RNP in parentheses. They're just simply going to say United 2348 cleared for the RNAV Zulu runway 8 into Rifle, Colorado. They don't even worry about the fact that it is an RNP. Okay, let's look at the parallel approach, the RNP or RNAV Yankee to runway 8. Same airport, this is the second approach, the Yankee, and you'll notice this one is set up for GPS. And so you'll typically see that. If you see an RNP procedure to a runway, you'll typically see a parallel GPS or non-RNP-AR procedure to the same runway. And the way ATC differentiates it is just by the letter. It's an RNAV Zulu or an RNAV Yankee. And the order depends on which procedure came first. If the basic procedures, the basic RNP procedures came first, then they might be the Zulus and the RNP-ARs might be the Yankees. They're just created in the certifying order. Okay, and this is another good example. If we go back to the iPad, you can see there is only LNAV minima published for this procedure. This is, again, the RNAV GPS Yankee to runway 8. This is a procedure that you could fly using an IFR certified GPS system, whether it's WAAS or basic GPS. But if we go down there and look at the minima, we'll notice there's no WAAS minima limit listed here. There's no LPs. There's just an LNAV. Why would they do that? Essentially, if the localizer precision or the LP minima don't give you any extra obstacle protection that would allow for a lower MDA or visibility requirements, they're not going to publish it. They'll just simply publish LNAV. And that's what happened here. When they looked at the different certification requirements for the LP minima and the LNAV minima, they found that they both end up with the exact same MDAs and visibility requirements. So in that case, they just published LNAV. And if you were to pull up this procedure in your database, it would show up as LNAV. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, looks like we got a question.
Okay, we have a ton of questions, and a lot of them are really going to tie into where we're going right now. But we're going to start off with Mark, and he wants to know this. When I turn on the GPS or when I'm flying one of these approaches, what messages am I looking for to ensure proper coverage and performance?
Okay, that is a fantastic question. First of all, there's two places you should always look on a GPS, an IFR GPS procedure. A receiver. Number one is you want to check the sensitivity or scaling on the procedure. And you'll know if you look at a typical WASP-based procedure, it'll turn into, or a receiver, you'll see term displayed for terminal, and then that will change into either LPV, LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV. That's the first place you want to check. You want to check that it's changing at the appropriate places along the procedure. And as you're flying down final approach, you also want to include that in your scan. Because if the approach needs to downgrade or you lose signal, that's going to show up in that kind of scaling, or people call it sensitivity table, okay, that message. The other place you want to watch is your alerts. And I see this a lot when you're flying a G1000 or a glass panel aircraft. There always seems to be an alert flashing at the bottom, and people just ignore it. I am too task saturated, they say, to go down there and check that alerts window. Bad news on an instrument approach, because that alerts or messages window, whether it's on a glass panel alert or just an alert on your GPS unit, that is the other place that your GPS system will tell you if something is happening and it no longer can give you LPV or LP or LNAV, VNAV performance criteria. So we've got 3 videos that go through that, and I'm going to get to them in just a second. And before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about scaling, because essentially that'll help you understand what your receiver is doing as you fly down final. And we're not going to get into the guts of the full set of scaling on a GPS procedure. We're just going to look basically at the intermediate to final approach segment and try to keep this very simple. Okay, so what I've got up right here is your typical WAS-based scaling, okay? WAS-based. And you're noticing that I'm not saying the words LNAV, VNAV, LPV, LP, or LNAV. I'm just saying WAS. And that's because regardless of the minima that you end up flying to, WAS-based systems that have WAS reception, that have that low-level, that super accurate performance, will essentially scale all of these procedures about the same way, whether it's an LNAV or a LPV. And what they're going to do laterally is they're going to bring you in what we typically call terminal sensitivity, plus or minus 1 nautical mile either side of center line until about 2 miles from the final approach fix. So as we approach 2 miles to the final approach fix, we're going to start to taper that scaling down so that the scale, full scale deflection of the CDI is plus or minus 0.3. So 0.3 either side of the center line at the final approach fix. From there, that's going to continue to scale down to about 700 feet at runway threshold. And that's 700 feet total width. So 350 feet each side of runway centerline. Okay, that general rule is true for LPV, LP, and an LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV variety when your WAS-based receiver has an appropriate WAS signal. There's some little variations. On LPs and LPVs, they're meant to mirror a localizer. And so they're not always 700 feet full width at the runway. That is kind of specially tailored. It could be a little smaller, it could be a little bigger, depending on the airport, okay? So that number is not really fixed. It depends on the approach certification. But as a general rule, it's going to be fairly close to 700 feet from full one side of the course to the other. The other interesting thing about an LP or an LPV is it will never get wider than 0.3 nautical mile deflection on either side of the course. So if you have a really long final approach, like a 15, maybe 20 mile long final approach, like Astoria does, a localizer would typically get way out there in final, wider than 0.3 nautical miles either side of course. But an LP or an LPV won't. They'll keep you right at 0.3 until that localizer style guidance would narrow to about 700 feet at the end. Okay, that WASP-based receiver, when it's flying an LNAV, VNAV, or an LNAV approach, will do almost the exact same thing. The difference is, again, we'll go back to the iPad, it's going to scale up to plus or minus 0.3 right as you reach your final approach fix, and then it will taper down to the 700-foot total width at the threshold. There's some different criteria for it, but really it's generally going to be about 700 feet total width. What I'm getting at here is simple. If you're flying with a WASP-based receiver and you have WASP-based reception, so you've got full WASP service, you've got the WASP level of accuracy, the scaling is going to feel for you the exact same, whether the system is flying a procedure with LPV or LP minima, or whether you're flying that procedure in rifle that only had LNAV minima. You're still going to scale down essentially to that 700 feet left to right deflection. Okay, looks like we have a question.
Okay, next up, the question is this. Do you need to check RAIM if your GPS is equipped with WAS?
Good question. I'm going to get into that in just a second, but the answer is no. WAS essentially replaces RAIM. Okay, the WASP signal from the WASP satellites provide a different form of integrity monitoring, and so therefore RAIM is already redundant. It's taken care of by your WASP-based service. However, if WASP was out of service or was noted to be out of service during your flight, even if you're like, hey, looks like I got reception, but I got a NOTAM saying it's going to be out of service, then you would need to check RAIM. And so if you look at a WASP-based GPS system, it also has the ability to go in there and do a RAIM prediction. Because if WAS isn't available, or if it's notamed to be unavailable, then yes, you have to check RAIM. Okay, back to this. Let's take a look at the exact same procedure. Flown, this, if you look at this diagram we have right here, this is a WASP-based system flying either LPV, LP, or LNAV minima. It's all going to look about the same. But basic GPS scaling looks completely different, even though it's flying to the same LNAV minima possibly that a WASP receiver would use. And that's because the capabilities of the system are different. As we approach 2 miles within the final approach fix, we taper down from plus or minus 1 mile either side of center line, down to that 0.3 miles at the final approach fix. So that part's about the same. What's different is we hold that 0.3 nautical miles either side of center line all the way down to the missed approach point. So again, this is flying to LNAV minima. Okay, but if you were flying this exact same procedure to LNAV minima with a WASP-based receiver and it had WAS, it's going to taper the scaling in as you go. So the important thing to keep in mind is, depending on your equipment and whether or not it has WASP-based service, the scaling could change on an LNAV or LNAV VNAV procedure. A WASP-based system will give you more tighter scaling. And so that's why I feel like, man, I've gone out there and I've flown LNAV procedures and I've flown LP and I've flown LP procedures, and outside of the glide path, they all seem to feel the exact same to me. That's because every time you flew them, the receiver probably had full WASP coverage, and so it was essentially scaling them all the exact same way. Okay, next question.
Okay, next up, we've got a question about this GPS approach that we're looking at Centennial. And the question is this: why do LPV and LNAV VNAV have decision altitudes instead of MDAs, even though they aren't considered precision approaches?
I know I always say every question is a great question. This is a fantastic question because it confuses everybody, okay? And you're right, it isn't a precision approach. An RNAV GPS procedure is not a precision approach. And if you learned to fly when I did, or earlier, in the 90s, precision approaches always had DAs, decision altitudes. Non-precision approaches always had minimum descent altitudes. That concept and terminology has stuck with us even though it is no longer valid. And so you'll still hear it, but it's no longer valid. And if you look in the FAA books, you will never find precision, DA, everything else, MDA. It's just still something we kind of associate with it. And that's why I think a lot of people get confused. A decision altitude is going to be used on basically any procedure that includes both vertical guidance and lateral guidance. Okay, whether it is officially an ICAO precision procedure or not, if it's offering approved, certified vertical and lateral guidance, then you're generally going to have a decision altitude. However, if you only have approved lateral guidance, then you're going to have a minimum descent altitude. And so why doesn't an RNAV procedure with vertical guidance like an LPV meet precision approach requirements? Well, the reason is because ICAO requires a lot of other things outside of just the fact that you have an accurate beam that can get you down to 200 feet to be considered a precision approach, of which I don't know all of them off the top of my head. And we will do a presentation on that in the future, what ICAO needs for a precision approach. But the way to think about it is, it's not the glide path and the accuracy of the localizer precision that's causing the problem. It's all of the other certification requirements of a precision approach. And so where does that show up when we look at RNAV procedures? It shows up in the alternate minimums, because when you're planning to use a GPS procedure as an alternate, you basically will notice that the standard or non-standard published alternate minimums are all non-precision. You need to use non-precision alternate minimums. You cannot use precision minimums. RNAV procedures, RNAV RMP procedures fall into a special category called approaches with vertical guidance, APV. And so you've got precision approaches, your typical ILS. You got approaches with vertical guidance, which would be your LPV and your LNAV VNAV. And then you've got non-precision approaches, your VORs, your loc onlys, your LPs, and your LNAV onlys. That's kind of the best way to look at it. But the one thing I always tell everybody, forget about the old association. Precision approaches have DAs, everything else has an MDA. That's no longer valid. Now, if it's got approved vertical guidance, it usually will use a DA. And if it does not have approved vertical guidance, then it's going to use an MDA. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention on that, someone's going to go, hey, there's these procedures in there called plus Vs, right? LNAV plus V. So does that mean I have a DA? And the answer is no. The plus V is not approved vertical guidance. It is advisory guidance. And so therefore, it does not change to a DA. It's essentially still an MDA. Okay, looks like we got another question.
We have a question that I think leads in beautifully to the next slides that you're going to go through, and that is this. The question is, what should you do if you're on an LPV approach and you lose WAS on the approach or before minimums?
Okay, so this is one of the best parts about the GPS system. We've got 3 videos that kind of step through 3 different scenarios, okay? Essentially, oftentimes we talk about, oh, we're going to lose GPS. Well, you probably won't lose all the GPS. I mean, you could, but maybe you'll just lose WAS, or you'll just lose a component of it. Well, your RNAV system can fail down, okay? If you were flying an LPV and it loses the WAS satellite, but it's still got RAIM, well, and if it's got barrel rating, it could do an LNAV VNAV. If it doesn't have barrel rating, but it's just got RAIM, at least it could still do LNAV minima. And so your system will fail down to the lowest level or the next level of precision that it can support. If you lose everything, if it no longer has RAIM or if there's no LNAV minima available, like that procedure in Telluride, then it's going to tell you to abort the procedure and you're going to go missed approach. But one of the things that people forget about when we're flying an RNAV procedure is that as part of our scan pattern, we need to both watch the scaling to make sure that it goes into what we used to call approach mode. On an old school GPS, it would say APR, like the Garmin's would say it in green. Approach mode, that means that it's got RAIM. On a WAS-based system, it will switch from terminal to show you your minima. So for example, it'll go from term to LPV, or term to LP, or term to LNAV VNAV. That's confirming that it meets the requirements to fly to those minima. And if anything changes throughout the procedure at any time, you're going to see that change both as a message from your system. So on a G1000, you know where the alerts pop up in the corner, and you will often see it as a change in that scaling. So LPV or LP, that will switch to something else. Okay, so we're going to take a look at an example of that. We're going to start we're going to fly the RNAV again to 17 left, right, Colin?
Nope, these are all to, this is the Crescent City approach, runway 36. So we've switched it up a little bit.
Always surprises. Okay, so we're looking at the procedure that we actually intro this video with, the Crescent City procedure to runway 36. And if you're flying that procedure in a WASP-based aircraft, you're always going to, as long as it's got WASP, you're going to get a LPV guidance. So let's take a look at a scenario where we start with WASP service, but we lose our WASP signal somewhere down the line. And we're going to look at this from the standpoint of a Cirrus SR-22 Turbo, in fact, our airplane that is equipped for barowaiding. So we have the capability to barowaid. Okay, let's go into the video. So what you can see here, I'm going to just point out a couple things right now. We're en route from Sitka to the Calais final approach fix. We're 2.8 nautical miles out. We've got a ground speed of about 104 knots. So we're a little over 2 minutes out, a little further than that. 1 minute out. We're a little further than that. And you can see that our GPS system has automatically switched to LPV guidance as we narrow in on the final approach fix. So it says right now, hey, I've got WASP, I meet the requirements for LPV. We're descending down to our final approach fix altitude at 1600, and then hopefully this glide path will descend on and we'll follow that down to the runway. Okay, so as we start flying, boom, right here, you just see this yellow LNAV VNAV. This is the way our software update alerts us to the fact that we have now lost our WASP-based coverage. And so right here, this I should pick up in my scan pattern. What this LNAV VNAV is telling me is that something has gone wrong with the RNP requirements for LPV, and I should now switch to the LNAV VNAV minima. And as we continue going, you're going to see that I'm going to quickly close this and come back to it so that we can, we're going to get that bug off. You see our logo. That's the most important thing. Let's see. I'm going to take it off from all three quickly. Try to be brand focused and look what happens. Okay, we're going to go back to that. And there's our message. And if you look at the message, approach downgrade. Approach downgraded, baro VNAV, use LNAV VNAV minima. Your message might be a little different. And even with a G1000 or a G1000 NXI, the colors that it uses or the message that it shows, different manufacturers, it can all change. That is not an FAA mandated set of terminology. It is not FAA mandated color. In your pilot's guides, it will often discuss what those are, though some of them don't always do a great job of it. But that's what we just saw to let us know that we've lost the ability to maintain that LPV version of RNP. What's gone wrong? We don't know. It could be an internal fault with the unit, could be a loss of WASP-based reception, could be a lot of things. All we know is that the receiver can no longer guarantee that 95% accuracy at the RNP value required for an LPV approach. So it selected what it can do. And in this case, it said, well, I've got RAIM and I'm equipped for baro VNAV. So I'm going to switch to the LNAV VNAV minima. And that's what we see. And from there, we'll go down. Okay. The one thing that will also switch, which we did not animate, once it goes to LNAV VNAV on a Garmin system, you're going to switch from a diamond to something that looks like a little sideways house. They call it a pentagram, and it's going to look like this. It's going to look like a little box that goes like that. It's filled in. So that's the symbol that you'll see the glide slope change to. Okay, so in that case, what am I going to do as a pilot? I'm just going to look down at my LNAV VNAV minima. That's what I'm going to, that's my new decision altitude. That's what I'm flying to. There are a couple things to keep in mind. If you're flying with a glass cockpit aircraft, especially a G1000, we have typically queued our minima. There's that little curly Q that pops up right at decision altitude. That won't change. That's still going to be down at our old LPV invalid minima. And so essentially in this case, I just need to keep that in mind and say, yeah, I'm not going to see a Q at my new DA. There's a second thing to consider. If the procedure was to use step-down fixes and my fail-down left me below some sort of a fix, then I would have to execute a missed approach immediately. I can only downgrade, and the system won't know this. I, as the pilot, have to decide this. I can only accept the downgrade if I am now above all of the minimum altitudes for the new minima line on the approach. That's usually not a problem with LNAV VNAV, but it could be a problem in our next scenario. You'll notice, by the way, in this case, we lost, that's not the arrow I wanted, we lost our WAS more than a minute out from the final approach fix. On a Garmin unit, if you're LNAV VNAV capable, on our Garmin G1000NXi and many other Garmin units, if you're LNAV VNAV capable and you lose WAS reception more than 60 seconds from the final approach fix, it will switch, or it will try to downgrade to LNAV VNAV. If you're inside of 60 seconds or past the final approach fix, it will only downgrade all the way down to LNAV. And that's just a safety precaution. It has nothing to do with the ability, I think, to generate the symbol. What I really think it's just saying, hey, you don't have a lot of time to change this approach, so we're gonna keep you at a high minimum, an LNAV minimum. If you needed for some reason to get down to LNAV VNAV, you could execute a missed approach and fly the procedure again and load it up as an LNAV VNAV. Okay, so let's take a look at what would happen if the GPS was to lose WAS on the same procedure, except this time we are inside of the final approach fix. So we're between the final approach fix and the missed approach point. So right now we have full WAS reception. The aircraft is flying to LPV minima, and I've got my diamond. I'm following my glide path, and my needle is centered. Obviously, the autopilot must be on. So as I go down, right here, you can see inside between the final approach fix and the missed approach point, all of a sudden I see LPV switch to LNAV, and on our unit, it turns yellow to alert me briefly. And then all of a sudden, I see a message pop up. And again, it's just going to show up as an alert. I have to hit the button to read it. It says, approach downgrade. Approach downgraded. Use LNAV minima. And you'll notice that now matches with the LNAV that I see on my HSI for scaling. So now I'm going to look down at my chart. I'm going to look at the LNAV minima, and I'm going to level out at the MDA. And again, if the LNAV minima requires a step-down fix and I find that I'm below a minimum altitude, I'm going to immediately execute a missed approach. As long as I'm above all the minimum altitudes for the LNAV minima, then I can continue flying LNAV in to the missed approach point. And again, in this case, what I would probably do, when I fly a DA altitude, I always set my altitude select to the missed approach top altitude. But in this case, what I would typically do then is dial that down to my new MDA, so at least I could see that MDA with an altitude select queue there. Okay, let's look at the third scenario. And this is a case where the GPS loses enough information that it can no longer guarantee any integrity. Essentially, it doesn't have WAS, and it no longer has the requirements for basic GPS. It can't guarantee RAIM either. And again, this could be because it's lost the satellites. It could be because of a receiver fault. It might actually be the correct position. It just can't verify it anymore. So again, in this case, we are between the final approach fix and the missed approach point. We're on glide path, and I'm at LPV minima. As I fly down, boom. Okay, so on our unit, at times, you'll see a couple things. Many units have the ability to do what's called a dead reckoning mode. Essentially, they can estimate your position using the accelerometers. And in this case, this unit had enough information to go into dead reckoning mode. So that's what this DR means. Now I've got in our unit a yellow CDI. That's a hint to me saying, hey, we've gone into dead reckoning mode. You're no longer following any precise guidance. And the LPV is turned yellow. At the same time, I get a GPS LOI badge. That means GPS loss of integrity. When you see something like GPS LOI, that lets you know that essentially the receiver is not quite sure where it is anymore. And even if it gives you a dead reckoning value, as you continue flying, that's going to get less and less and less accurate. If there's strong winds or winds are changing, that might not be accurate at all. Okay, and as we continue to fly along, Now you're going to see abort approach. Lots of GPS navigation. Abort approach. Okay, so what do you do when you're flying a procedure based on RNAV and your RNAV system comes back to you and says, I have no RNAV, I have no idea where you are, abort the procedure? Well, first of all, you want to start climbing. You're obviously going to climb at least to the top missed approach altitude. But if your minimum sector or safe altitude where you're at or where you think you could end up is higher, you're going to climb to that. And in my world, I'm going to climb to the highest of either the highest minimum sector altitudes or minimum safe altitude or the missed approach altitude. Depending on terrain, depending on obstacles, depending on traffic requirements, you know, any of those could be the highest. But I'm going to pick the highest out of those three. That's what I'm climbing up to. I've got a question, but I'm going to finish this line really quick. If I have DR, I'll use DR to navigate the procedure as best I can, okay, while I contact ATC. And then essentially, I'm going to let ATC know right away that I have lost my ability to navigate with RNAV and that I need to switch to alternate navigation. And that means I'm already spinning over to things like VHF nav to establish a position, and I'm asking ATC right away for vectors. That's the first thing I want from them. Again, I'm aviating, flying the airplane, navigating, okay, I'm going to try to, DR my position, bring up a VHF bearing pointer on a VOR if there's one in the area, establish where I am, and then last, communicate. Let ATC know what's happened and what I need. The most important thing is, hey guys, I don't know where I'm at anymore. I need vectors. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, so Mark's got a good question that goes back to the first two scenarios. And what he says is, if the GPS downgrades the approach, but you can continue, do you need to inform ATC?
Good question. You do have a loss of navigation capability, which is a required report under IFR. The impact to you is that you're going to fly to lower minima. That's not part of your approach clearance. And so what I would say is you do need to tell ATC, but when you tell ATC depends on your workload, okay? If I'm flying down final approach and I downgrade, I'm probably already over to CTAF. I'm not going to say anything to ATC right now. If that was to happen earlier on in the procedure and I've got the time and the ability to both first verify my new minima, ensure that I'm above all the altitudes, make sure that I can safely fly the approach. Again, we're flying the airplane first. Aviate and navigate, okay? Yeah, I got that, no problem. Okay, new minima is here. Okay, everybody's happy? We're happy. Then, sure, if I'm still in contact with ATC, I'd make that call then, and I'd say something simple like, hey, Seattle Center, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, we've lost some level of GPS integrity. We can still continue to fly the procedure. Be aware there may be a WAS outage in the area, or it could be our equipment. I'm telling ATC right away, something's happened. I've lost possibly WAS, but I can still navigate this procedure. No assistance is necessary. If my workload's too high and I cannot make that call right now and I just need to fly the airplane, that's fine. What I will do is inform ATC either after I land, when I close out my flight plan, I'll let them know what happened, or I'll inform them on the missed approach once I have the time to communicate. Okay, next question.
Okay, next question is this. What computes the glide path in an LNAV VNAV approach if you have WAS on board?
Great question. Essentially, it's going to do exactly what it would do for an LPV. It's going to use, if you have WAS on board and WAS is available, your system's going to use the WAS-based GPS information to compute that glide path. And if you were to fly a procedure that had no LPV minima published, and it was just LNAV, VNAV, and LNAV, and you had a WAS-based system, I think all of them would use WAS first because it is the most precise. And it would fly that LNAV procedure still using the satellite WAS system for guidance. It, I think, would only fall back to Baro VNAV if it did not have WAS, because Baro VNAV is not nearly as accurate. And again, that's one thing to keep in mind, that these procedures or these receivers are always trying to give you the best accuracy, even if the minima are less, kind of less accurate. But again, I can't guarantee that. I can't guarantee, that every receiver would go WAS and Baro VNAV, but that's what I would assume would happen. Okay, next question.
Harry wants to know this. What would happen if the GPS determined that the aircraft were outside of whatever scaling limits were set, or integrity limits?
So that's exactly what you see when we show you that downgrade. If the GPS system, so first of all, scaling and integrity are a little bit different, and we kind of look at them as the same, but they're not. Scaling is how wide your CDI is. Okay, that's essentially from center to full scale left. That's your scaling. So 0.3 scaling, that's from center to full scale left or full scale right would be 0.3 miles. Okay, that's scaling. Integrity is different. Integrity is saying, okay, I know that I think you're here, but in all reality, you're not exactly there, but I do know that you are within 0.3 miles of there, or 40 meters of there, or 1 mile of there. That's the difference between scaling and integrity. Scaling is showing you where you are based off where the GPS thinks you should be, okay? And integrity is the GPS saying, excuse me, saying, I think you're right here, but I really know that's probably not right. You're just somewhere in this big zone. If the GPS realized that you're outside of its integrity limits, if it realized that its integrity estimations weren't right, then you would end up with a downgrade and a message. If you deviate far enough off the scale that the scale goes full scale, the GPS is just going to show you typically cross-track error, and it's leaving it up to you as the pilot to fix it. And of course, if we end up there, we should be flying a missed approach procedure. But that's something to think about. Again, and it's really can get confusing. Scaling is just how far left and right the CDI is. Integrity is the system saying, okay, I think you're here, but I know that's not really your position. Your position is this kind of big area, and you're within 40 meters of where I think you are. Okay, next question.
Next question is this. Is baro aiding the primary reason why so many plates have temperature restrictions for the LNAV VNAV procedures due to the true altitude above the ground?
Okay, that is another fantastic question.
They're all good ones.
These are great questions. So that's part of the reason. You can find temperature restrictions on non-baro aided procedures, okay? And that's simply because when they estimate your sea level pressure, essentially your altimeter will read accurately on the ground at that airport, okay? So when you get that altimeter setting and you set that in, what that means is at the moment it was taken and computed, sitting at the airport reference point or at the sensor site or somewhere there, your altimeter would read accurate field elevation, okay? As you start to climb, those pressure levels aren't at that standard 1 inch per 1,000 feet. In cold weather, they're much closer. In warm weather, they're much farther apart. The problem is with the closer. Farther apart means you're high. Hey, you may not make it out of the clouds, but you're not going to hit anything, okay? So if the temperature is much warmer than standard, you're not really as low as you think you are. You're actually a lot higher. But when it's really cold, those pressure levels kind of condense. And so now you're much lower than the altimeter says you are. And so that right there causes that cold temperature problem. That's magnified when we start to use baro VNAV, because now not only are we using the altimeter system to tell you your DA or MDA at the bottom, but we're also using it to try to draw a glide path. And that glide path isn't going to be completely right because of the cold temperature. So yes, uncompensated baro VNAV systems will oftentimes have temperature limitations on them. However, most modern baro VNAV systems can compensate for non-standard temperatures. And so you'll actually type in the system what that temperature is at the airport, and it will use that to redraw your glide path. All that being said, even with compensated baro VNAV or WASP-based guidance, so LPV or LNAV VNAV, if the temperature is cold enough and there's an obstacle that's just at the right height, you could still end up with a temperature limitation and an MDA or DA adjustment, even if it's not baro VNAV. Okay, next question.
Next up, Serge wants to know this. How do you know if you have a GPS with baro aiding?
That is another great question. I'm going to stop saying that. But Serge, you ask questions a lot, which I really appreciate. I like hearing the same names. Hopefully it means that people are really enjoying these. The easiest place to look is going to be in your pilot's operating handbook or your airplane flight manual or the supplement that was issued with the GPS that's installed in your manual. So that paperwork is really, really important. Don't look at the paperwork you download online, okay? So you'll find a lot of flight schools will post a G1000 manual online. They're like, hey, everybody, use this to study. That is different than the manual in your airplane flight manual. And that's because the same equipment can be certified for different things on different installations. Not every aircraft will have the same capabilities, even though it may have a G1000 in the front. These systems are incredibly versatile. I mean, you could have them equipped with DME and Baro VNAV and all these different things, or you couldn't. So let me see if I can find that really quick. I'm going to open up ForeFlight because that's where I keep my aircraft's copy of the POH. And again, this is not the actual flight manual, but it matches, in this case, it matches our flight manual. So I'm going to go forward and I'm going to look at limitations. And I believe it's going to be in systems and equipment limits here, and just give me a second. It's going to take me a second to find it. So in this section right here, you can see what you're allowed to fly. So this is this is kind of where you're finding that answer. So in paragraph G, the prospective integrated avionics system is compliant with AC 90-100A, and so it is eligible to fly RNAV Q or T routes, RNAV SID stars ODPs, and eligible to use RNAV substitution or RNAV as an alternate means of navigation. So that's what tells us that we can use RNAV. And then if we keep going down, here it says that we can use SBAS or GPS for IFR route terminal and approach. And this is the Baro VNAV, I believe. Oh, I think it says it differently. No. There we go. It's M. So L says that we can fly LNAV, VNAV, and LPV. M says barometric vertical navigation, Baro VNAV operations may be conducted if SBAS is unavailable or disabled. And then it'll say the prospective avionics system will provide automatic temperature compensated glide path vertical guidance and has been shown to meet the accuracy requirements of VFR, IFR, en-route terminal, and approach Baro VNAV operations within the conterminous US and Alaska in accordance with AC 2138D. So, this is a great question, and you notice there's a lot of paragraphs there and there's a lot of requirements because the RNAV and GPS requirements are huge. There's a billion things that you can do with them and they all have different levels of certification. Digging through the aircraft's airplane flight manual and reading that limitations or the limitations in the supplement, that's where you'll find out if your aircraft is Baro VNAV equipped. One last caveat. A lot of flight schools have a mix of different airplanes. They all might be G1000 Cessna 172s, but they're different years. They were bought from different people. They didn't all come in the same order, and so they're not all the exact same. Just because one of those installations is approved for Baro VNAV doesn't mean the other one is. And so be careful when you're flying in a fleet of mixed airplanes that you don't just make an assumption, hey, all these must be approved because I saw in the POH that one is, and they all look the same. Keep in mind that equipment and certification requirements can change between serial numbers, and you really, if you're flying different aircraft, either your flight school needs to say, yep, nope, they're all certified. Here's the master AFM that represents the entire fleet, or you need to be checking each one of those aircraft to determine your requirements. Okay, last thing I'll say there, if the aircraft isn't certified for Baro VNAV, the RNAV system should not offer it to you. That's the concept. So one other way you would know it's not capable of Baro VNAV is if you lose WAS, it's not going to even give you an LNAV VNAV option. It's just going to drop straight down to LNAV. Okay, next question.
Okay, we got time for one last question here, and then we've got others that we're going to answer in the chat. So if everybody hangs on, we'll try to get to those as quickly as we can. The question is this: are planned GPS outages always 100% out with no service, or are there different levels of outages?
That's a really good question. We've actually talked to the FAA about this. There's different NOTAMs for different things. And keep in mind that just because it's NOTAMed out of service doesn't necessarily mean that it will be out of service 100% of the time. But if it is NOTAMed out of service, then you need to treat it as if it could be and have alternate navigation options. So if WAS is NOTAMed to be unavailable at an airport, like an alternate airport, then you would need to use the basic GPS rules when planning for an alternate there. If you get there and you actually have WAS, it is available, you can start the WAS procedure. Just be aware that it may go away at some point in time. And so that's something to think about. If just because it's NOTAMed doesn't mean it will be gone, but then for planning purposes, if SBAS is NOTAMed to be out of service, you need to plan the flight as if you were not SBAS equipped. While you're actually flying, sure, if you got the signal, you can use it. But the flight needs to be planned and the routes that you accept need to be flown with the fact that, yeah, I can fail back to VHF if this happens to go away, or basic GPS if it happens to go away. Okay, as Colin said, we have some more questions in the chat, so we're going to try to get those through with comments. Also, I know we cannot cover all things LPV, RNAV, GPS in one sitting. I think everybody would go crazy, so we'll do more of these. Let us know both in the comments section on this video. Also send us emails to let us know what more you would like to hear about on this topic, what examples you'd like to see. That'll help us out. We'll get more of this out in the future. A couple other quick items. Oshkosh is coming up in a couple weeks. Boldmethod will be at Oshkosh. We'll be teaching Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 12:45 p.m. at the EAA Pilot Proficiency Center. Each of those days, there's some VFR and IFR presentations there. They're fantastic presentations. We'd really like to meet you in person. So if you're going to Oshkosh, we'd love to have you at those presentations at the Pilot Proficiency Center. That's a mouthful. And they're 100% free. So all you got to do is show up. And then we'll be walking around. We don't have a booth, but we're walking around. We got working with different vendors. And so if you see us, please stop by and say hi. And otherwise, if you'd like to learn something from this video tonight, please let us know in the comments and give us a thumbs up. We really appreciate it, and it helps increase our search rank. Thanks again tonight, and we hope to see you at Oshkosh or online in a couple weeks. Good night.